morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to introduce this first workshop on public policy workshop of the climate neutrality and on food security. I really thanks all the participants and of course people who will take the floor: Alexander, Natalie, Eric, Patrick, Celia. This is quite an important meeting for us. This is the first of a series of workshop. You'll see a bit later that the project started beginning of January. So in a 6 months time, the different organizers success in setting up this workshop. So I think it's very important. What's the topic of this workshop? First of all, it's a ClieNFarms workshop. It's quite important. ClieNFarms is climate neutral farm, and what we know from the last month is that the war in Ukraine put food security in the center of the political debate, and sadly, of course, and the war raises some legitimate concerns over input availability and food price increases in the EU, but also all around the world, and as well in the several trade-dependent countries such as North Africa and Middle East, and so on. So availability and affordability of food is of top priority for everyone, and even in Europe, I know that prices increase a lot. But big concern is that increasing production at the expense of the environment is far from being a good solution. We really need to make our food production system less reliant on external inputs, fossil fuel, fertilizer, imported feed, and so on, and to be more resilient, more sustainable, of course. And this is really already outlined in the EU Farm to Fork strategy, but it was before the war. And farm practices that reduce input use are often the same ones as the ones that help climate neutrality. There is a big correlation between these different practices. And I think it's also important to add that some countries in Europe started to reuse fossil fuels such as coal, and that will increase, of course, CO2 production. And we need to do a larger effort to store and sequester carbon in the coming years and even months. So this workshop will try to shed light on this debate and discuss solutions for climate neutral farming, while ensuring food security, but even more than food security, also viable, sustainable farms. Such solutions are really required at farm level and across all the entire food system, production system. And we will also have to debate the EU's dependence on feed and fertilizer imports, as well as the need for dietary change and reduction of food waste. So all these topics are part of the Farm to Fork strategy, but the different projects were in a silo way. Of course, it's important to understand, but we really need to intercross, hybridise the different projects in order to have a full view of that. So as I said just previously, that the workshop is organized by ClieNFarms, which is one of the numerous projects funded by ASH 2020. This is a project that tests solution for climate neutral farms. Climate neutral farm, as you know, that it will be a farm that we try to strongly decrease greenhouse gases, increase carbon storage, and work as well with the albedo of the grassland and so on. And the project started in January 2022. As part of this project, ClieNFarms organizes a series of public policy workshops to stimulate a dialogue between scientists, policymakers, and raise awareness about the outcomes of the project. So, as I said, it's very important for us to do some cross workshop because only a systemic, holistic view of the food problem may lead to very interesting solution. So if you don't mind, I may stay. But we go to the next. So just a welcome aspect, and I will go to explain a bit more of the ClieNFarms project. Bram.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jacques-Éric, for your introduction. Then I now have the pleasure to introduce the two speakers. We will set the scene for today's workshop. And the first speaker will be Alexander Müller. He's a managing director at the Think Tank for Sustainability, TMG. He has a very rich CV. It's impossible to introduce all his posts, but I will highlight two. He has been Assistant Director General at the FAO and also study lead for Deep Agri-Food, where he studied the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity for agriculture and food. So we're very honored that Alexander Müller can be with us today. And so I invite him to come on the screen and share his presentation.
Thanks a lot, Bram. Thanks a lot, ClieNFarms, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, but it's not a pleasure to talk about the food crisis, because from my perspective, what we are going to do today is trying to analyze where do we really stand and what are maybe the perspective of the food crisis. And now I'm trying to present my screen. Can you already see it?
Yes, but not in the presenter's mode. In the presentation mode, it's the editing mode now.
So now
yes,
it's
perfect now. Yes.
Thanks a lot. So let me start with an introductory remark. I think that we are interested in transformation of agriculture have to be very careful. We have to provide a sound analysis why we are in the current situation, and we have to work on a solution which solves the immediate problem of hunger and starts seriously transformation of food systems. And that is why I want to highlight in my presentation that we have to deal with the 4 big C's. With climate, we already see the impact of climate on food systems. With conflict, and conflict means the Russian war in Ukraine, but also other conflicts. We still have to deal with COVID. The pandemic is not over. And we are currently in a situation where we have very high food costs and very high food prices. And we know from 2008, from the food price crisis, that this has far-reaching impacts on the poor, especially in developing countries, but not only in developing countries. It will also have impacts on vulnerable population in the developed world. So let me start with some main messages. The first one is currently we have to acknowledge that the global trade system as we know it, and we have criticized it a lot, is disrupted. Over the last decades, a system has been established where, quote and unquote, cheap agricultural commodities dominated the markets. Let us also see that the high food prices started even before the war in Ukraine. We had very high fossil fuel prices in October, November last year, and before the war started, we could already see an increase of food prices. Now, with the Russian war in Ukraine, exports have been blocked, wheat, sunflower oil, and others. This blocking of exports is not a result of the sanctions. Food and fertilizers are not part of the sanctions, but it's a political issue of the Russians, and also because the ports of Ukraine have been blocked. What we can see is that we have to deal with a lock-in effect of the current global trade system of food. And what we also can see is the climate crisis and degradation of natural resources biodiversity, land degradation, water scarcity, flooding, has already impacted food systems. And therefore, my main message today is that we have to talk about the transformation of food systems. They have to be designed and implemented to tackle the intertwined challenges of climate, biodiversity, land, water, but we have to do it in the time of a food crisis. This is really important. If we propose solutions that will start in 3 years' time, this is not sufficient. Now we see a lot of people who are presenting solutions which immediately start, but they have a negative effect on the transformation and the sustainability. And therefore, one of my messages is that all actions tackling the current food crisis must not have adverse effects on transformation. My last introductory message is we are entering a phase where food security is a geopolitical topic. Some people already say that Russia is going to use hunger in developing countries as a weapon. These are my 6 main starting points, and now let me go through my presentation. Food prices in March have reached a record high. You can see it here on this screen. You see 2020, 2021, and already at the end of 2021, we went up, and in 2022, in March, we reached a record high. It's now a little bit lower, but the prices are still very high. What we see is that the prices for food for poor people are not only very high, but what is worrying me a lot is if you look at the trade aspects of it. Poorer importing countries are hit hardest, and the question is, do they have enough currency, US dollars, in order to pay their imports? There are calculations that we will see pretty soon that the first countries do not have enough foreign currency to pay for their imports, and imports in terms of fertilizers and wheat and other foods. Today, I will talk a lot about fertilizers. Don't worry, I'm not a fertilizer salesman, and I think fertilizers are more part of the problem than they are part of the solution. But the current system of commodities being traded and the current system of increased production is linked to fertilizers in a way which is not sustainable and which will create problems. And my fear is, colleagues and friends, that the current problem of food security, where we see high prices, might get a lot worse. Currently, we have an excess problem. People don't have money to buy food. But it might happen, and I will come back to it, that we can see the crisis developing more into a type of crisis like we had 1970, where we had a shortage, a real shortage of food. And if you look back into the data, you could see that the excess mortality data shows us that millions of people died of hunger, famine, and malnutrition. And this is a real risk, and therefore your event is so very timely and policy recommendations are so important. So let me again look at how did we get into the mess where we are today. The first thing is, let us not forget, we are still struggling with the COVID restrictions. And here we have something very, very strange. On the one hand, the COVID restrictions have been lifted, and this at the end of last year led to a surge in demand and to a surge in the demand for energy, and these led to high energy prices. I already mentioned it, October, November last year. But at the same time, the supply chains are disrupted. Global trade is very expensive. If you want to ship something from A to B, the costs are a lot higher than a year or 2 years ago. And these soaring energy prices started before the war in Ukraine. That's really important. And the exports from Russia and Ukraine, and they are 2 of the largest food exporters in the world, wheat 30%, maize 6%, sunflower oil 60%. These export restrictions imposed by the Russians and by the war really fueled the increase in price of food. Russia is also the largest exporter of fertilizers. Many people don't know it. Russia is using its oil and natural gas in order to produce fertilizers, and I will show you the dependency of some countries to these fertilizers. What we see is that Russia is on the one hand taking away wheat from Ukraine and trying to sell it. They are going to block exports. This also will lead to higher prices. And the ports in the Black Sea are closed. And if Ukraine wants to harvest in this season or the next season, they cannot export it. And this all leads to higher prices. And now what we are seeing is that what was already happening in 2008, that producing countries are imposing export restrictions because there's uncertainty, because they want to earn more money for many, many reasons. And hoarding and speculation is going to take place, and hunger is used as a weapon. All of this led to higher food prices. It's a little bit floating, but overall, it's a lot higher, and we are definitely in a crisis of very high food prices, and this is hitting the poorest people the first and the most. So now let me show you how much many countries are depending on export, and I will use the example of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. I hope you can see it. Eritrea, 100% of its wheat imports from Russia in blue and Ukraine in orange. Kazakhstan, 95%. Mongolia, 93%. You can go up, and I'm happy to share this presentation with all the participants as a PDF so that you can see. I'm using always the example of Egypt. Egypt is importing 70% of its wheat for the bread of the population from Russia and Ukraine. It's 13 million tons annually. What is going to happen if they cannot import it? It's a big, big crisis. But the import dependency on wheat is not the only challenge. Now I'm putting a slide here, the fertilizer import dependency in 2021 from Russia and Ukraine. Russia is blue, and you can see everything blue. Mongolia, I'm going from the bottom up, Mongolia, Belarus, Finland, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Serbia. All these countries are importing their fossil fuel-based fertilizers from Russia. And again, I'm not a salesman of fertilizers. I want to show that over the last decades, we have been locked into a situation where export of agricultural commodities, quote unquote, cheap commodities, and export of fossil fuel-based fertilizers were responsible for increased production. This is not sustainable. This has huge impacts on the climate, and this is what we are going to see now, and many people will suffer from it. So now let's try to look into the future a little bit. What could happen at the end of this year and in 2023? The farmers now in the Northern Hemisphere decide what and how much to plant. This is important for how much food is available next year. We can see the impact of climate already on the next season. We have very high temperatures in India. We have very high temperatures in parts of the US. We have wildfires in California. We have floods currently in Australia. Or will the climate be favorable? We don't know it, but we have to deal with these uncertainties, and we see the negative impacts. Fertilizers are very expensive. I've been to Kenya 8 weeks ago in Kakamega County, and farmers are telling us fertilizers cost now 6 to 8 times more than before. And in some parts of the countries, you don't get it. Now, again, I'm not a salesman of fertilizers, but these production systems are locked into fossil fuel-based inputs. They're expensive, and therefore farmers don't buy a lot. They don't have alternatives. They don't have the knowledge. That's the transformation question. And therefore, it might happen that next year's harvest will go down. Now let's look at the currently available stocks. The absolute number of tons of grain in the stocks is not so important. It's the stocks to disappearance ratio. So how much stocks are used within a certain amount of time. And if we enter the next year, stocks are really strained. If you look at wheat and the wheat stocks for exports, there is only wheat for 45 days. The lowest since the last price crisis in 2006, 2008. And therefore, colleagues and friends, we have to tackle the 4 Cs and their impact on food security in an integrated way. Climate, we have to argue very strong for drastically reducing emissions from fossil fuels. But even if we would go to zero as soon as possible, the climate impacts remain in the atmosphere, and therefore the climate and the weather dictates the outcomes. What kind of weather do we have? How do we have to be prepared? And therefore, transformation of agriculture is important. The conflicts, it's the war in Ukraine, but let's not forget we have a civil war in Ethiopia. We have the war in Yemen. We have war and civil unrest elsewhere, and this will impact food security. COVID-19 is still not over. The pandemic is going on, and people expect it to get worse in winter again, and we have the high costs. So what do we have to do? 2 more slides on short-term and medium-term solutions. And again, these solutions have to be integrated. So if countries like Egypt are running out of food, it will take time to transform agriculture. And therefore, we need short-term solutions, but they have to be integrated with the transformation. The biggest risk currently is that the fertilizer industry, the pesticides industry, is going to use the looming hunger crisis to promote business as usual and to try to sell more fertilizers. And therefore, in the short term, it will be necessary, I'm convinced, to set up a food import facility to support vulnerable countries that they can pay for their food imports, because the risk is they are running out of foreign currencies. There is an idea that in order not to give more money to Russia to fuel the war, that there should be a different system in the Iraq war, but it failed, I have to say. There was oil for food program. Maybe we have to develop something different. We have to ensure transparency on the food markets. And this is my main point. We in the developed world, we have to offer those countries who are in need that we are going to share our stocks. In my country, in Germany, we are currently using 60% of all grains as animal feed or to produce agro-energy. Overall, hundreds of millions of tons of grains are used to produce agro-energy or bioenergy and animal feed. Can we continue business as usual, or do we have to offer to countries, we have enough crops for the next 2 or 3 years until you transform your food systems, until you produce enough, until we are getting out of the crisis, we are willing to share our crops? I'm personally convinced we have to do it, because otherwise the crisis will continue and many people will pay a very high price. Personally, I think we have to do the opposite what we have done with vaccines against COVID. In COVID times, we did not share the vaccines. Here we have the food, here we have the stocks, we have to share it. And therefore, this has to be linked with the transformation. Fossil fuels got us into this mess with climate and with the dependency for fertilizers and quote unquote cheap agricultural commodities. We have to stop the perverse subsidies of fossil fuels. And we also have to look how much fossil fuels do we use in our food systems. We did a rough calculation in the European Union. Currently, our food system uses 26% of all fossil fuel energy consumed. This is not sustainable. We have to do our homework. We need alternative energy, solar and wind. Don't want to talk a lot about it. And we have to change the agricultural practices. We have to deal with soils in a different way. We have to bring nitrogen into the soil in a different way. We have to tackle food losses and waste. This is what we know. There are people who say, let's invest in green ammonia. There are programs of agroforestry. And as the former lead of the TEEP agri-food, I would say we need to do a true cost accounting for food systems and price adjustments. As a result, we can see that the current system with cheap food is very, very expensive. And the people who are producing organic food or zero greenhouse gas emission food, and their food is perceived as being expensive, they are producing the much more cheaper food. And therefore, the combination of what we have to do is bring together a combination of short and long-term responses, because there is a risk that a hunger crisis is looming on the horizon, and therefore short-term action, sharing food, setting up a food financing facility to avoid the real prospect of food shortages. But let us really fight against those who are promoting now that now forget the environment, now forget organic, now forget everything, we have to feed the world. These people are responsible for the current lock-in situation, and the Russian war in Ukraine has unveiled that we are locked into an unsustainable food system, and therefore food system transformation has to be on the agenda. But we have to argue for short-term solutions to fight against hunger, and in parallel, seriously start with food system transformation. This was my presentation. I know that I don't have very good perspectives, but we are in a serious situation, and it needs joint efforts of all of us to tackle the immediate crisis and to seriously start with food system transformation. My last sentence, you all know it, the UN had started a food system summit only a year ago. This summit is an example of how not to do it, because it didn't trigger action, and what we need now is short-term and medium action starting at the same time. Thanks a lot, Bram. Next time, please invite me with a different title and with a different subject so that I can also bring positive messages. But we have to raise alarm. The situation is really dire. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alexander. Indeed, it's a very sobering message that you bring. The different crises come together, and we need to take short-term and long-term action, as you said. And I think it's indeed not a moment now to just run and try to do whatever we can, but think carefully on the short term and the long term, so that we can keep this long-term vision of sustainable food systems, but at the same time address the crises that are now emerging very quickly. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Nathalie Bolduc. She's working at EDRI, where she studies the political economy of transition of agriculture and food. So please, Nathalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I fear that my presentation will not be much more joyous, but hopefully it will be at least complimentary. And I look forward to the discussion afterwards. And thank you for having me here today. So to start with a couple of key messages, if my presentation will decide to work, here we go. As we've already discussed, there have been lots of concerns recently about food systems, and a lot of emphasis has been put on the farm to fork strategy, which was the communication published in 2020 by the European Commission to implement or start to think about the Green Deal in the context of the agricultural sector. And what we've seen is that while there have been lots of debates, even before the publication of this document, about whether we can actually transition to more sustainable systems, the war in Ukraine has really accelerated these discussions and put a lot of the transformations that were en route or starting to happen prior to the war in jeopardy because of these food security questions. And so today I would like to talk about the current food security problems that are caused by the war and have already been talked about, and talk about how they've really, for me as a researcher, illuminated the structural vulnerabilities and shown the different problems that we're facing in the EU and also globally. Second, I want to talk about the farm to fork targets, because there's, as I said before, lots of talk about them being too ambitious, but rather I would like to say that the critiques don't look at the whole picture, and we need to think about how in the long term these targets can help us move to more resilient and productive systems. And the topic of today is talking about climate, and so we can't talk about the changes necessary without saying that if we transition, we can have positive climate benefits. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we really need to think about productivity and resilience and sustainability. And I will try to not be too academic today, but I look forward to questions at the end if there's anything that isn't clear. And it's been nice that we've already been talking about fertilizers, and I am not a fertilizer salesperson either, but I think this is a really important subject to talk about in terms of vulnerabilities, because as has already been mentioned, not only are third countries outside of the EU dependent on fertilizer inputs, but also the EU is, and this is what we see in the graph on the left. And on the right, we see that the primary trading partner is the Russian Federation, which leads us to a situation in the current times where we're highly dependent on a country that is currently under sanctions, currently at war, etc., and using some of these tools, as was rightly stated, as political weapons. At the same time that we're having this dependence, we're also using too much fertilizer in the EU, and this is a really big problem because this is leading to environmental challenges. And so here on these graphs, we really see that where there's red, it basically means we need to reduce our use of fertilizers, particularly nitrogen fertilizer. And so with the fertilizer question, we have a situation in the EU where we are dependent on external sources, but at the same time, we're overusing what could be perhaps reduced going forward, leaving also some windows for opportunity. The second topic that I wanted to talk about in terms of structural vulnerabilities is the question of animal feed. And these graphs are in French, but I think I'll quickly explain them. The purpose is basically to show that animal feed is a big portion of not only oil seeds, but also cereals. And so we have a situation where much of what we're producing is going to feed animals instead of to feed people, which goes back to the previous presentation. And as was rightly noted, if we can prioritize or reprioritize how we use cereals and oil seeds, we can change some of these dynamics around availability and perhaps accessibility of food going into the future. And speaking about dependencies as well, we see that the EU imports a lot of calories through proteins to feed animals, and a lot of these imports are coming from Ukraine. So when we have a situation like today, we have countries such as the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain that are using about 90% of feed from outside of the farm. And so these countries are in big difficulty to feed animals now because of the different blockades, because of different questions about harvests, et cetera, that have already been touched on. And so we have a situation in the EU where the animal sector is really in crisis because of this lack of resilience and because of this dependency. And at the same time, I want to talk about the window of opportunity here as well, which is that not only do we use too much fertilizer, but we also eat too many animal proteins in the EU. And so there's an opportunity here to reduce consumption in order to address some of these issues. So this takes us to the farm to fork. And as I said before, this has been highly criticized, debated specifically now. But if you take a step back, this document presents a systemic approach to food system sustainability that looks at the economic aspect, it looks at environmental sustainability and social sustainability. And it looks at supply and demand measures as well as having some specific references to trade. And these targets are ambitious, but as I've said multiple times, but I really would like to drive home, they are coherent with the need to foster the resilience and sustainability of our system. And the Farm to Fork is already starting to present some solutions to the vulnerabilities that I talked about in terms of nitrogen and in terms of feed, although this is a little bit more indirect than the wording on nitrogen. And in addition, these different targets are largely in line with the most recent food system scenarios that say, how do we get to where we want to go? So if we talk about the Eat Lancet report, or we talk about future Nordic diets, all of these studies tend to have different elements that are coherent with the farm to fork strategy. And I would like to take a minute now to touch on the three main critiques of the farm to fork in order to walk us through some of the evidence and point to some areas where the farm to fork may not be as detrimental as has been stated by some stakeholders. And so the first one, of course, is probably the most pressing immediately, is about food security and saying, okay, well, if we put the farm to fork targets into place, we're going to have a situation that really harms the rest of the world by reducing production. The second one is around farmer incomes and jobs in the EU. And then the third critique is about the cost of food for poor consumers. And what we see is a lot of these points have been raised first in studies done, for example, by the GRC or by USDA that say, well, in our economic model, we have a situation where if we put these into place, we're going to have a big problem. And a lot of these studies, except for the EGRI study from my organization that I'll talk about later, are based on economic modeling that has a hard time taking into account systemic transformations, which is what we will need to do in order to tackle these vulnerabilities in the long term, and also, as Alexander was saying, some of these short-term problems. And so on food availability, the TIFA scenario, which was published by some of my colleagues, is a biotechnical biomass modeling exercise. And what this study tells us is that with a set of assumptions that are aligned with the farm to fork targets, but are actually more ambitious than the farm to fork itself, we can have a situation where with changes in diets and feeding strategies, that even with using agroecological production, we have a net increase in our exports of calories. And so while some of the questions about production are very important, we have to think about a systemic transformation. And so if we can change the food loss issue, if we can look at consumption, if we look at the different methods of production, there's the opportunity here to make systems not only more resilient, but also more productive. And this is what we see in this graph, is basically that if we change to agroecological production, we can have a situation where the EU becomes a net exporter of calories, as I said. But if we don't take into account the waste and diets, etc., we will have a problem. And that's what you see in the brown bar. And that's saying we only transform supply, but not demand, and points to this need to look at diets. On jobs and on farmer incomes, we know that manufacturing and processing are really important job givers in the EU. And so this is basically what this slide is trying to summarize, and saying that we need to pay attention to what happens if we do some sort of long-term transformation away from livestock because of climate and because of diet and because of environmental issues, but also food security issues. But in some preliminary evidence, particularly for France, we see that this big problem around jobs is not something that's inevitable, but it depends on policy solutions and what approach we tend to take. And so my colleagues did some modeling and looked at some different trade-offs between jobs and production and climate mitigation. And what we see is that if we emphasize biodiversity more, for example, we might mitigate climate a little bit less. If we're very focused on farm jobs, we can prioritize that perhaps to the detriment of production. But just to say that job loss is not something that necessarily will be inevitable, or is not something that will be taken, lightly by researchers, but it is to say that job loss is something that we can plan for and hopefully mitigate to a certain extent. And then on the cost of food, this is a study again from France. And this is a really, really interesting study and I'll translate again very quickly. But if we look at loss and waste, and so on the right, we have a situation where we divide loss and waste by 2. And on the left, we'll have a situation where there isn't any reduction. And then the authors compared a vegetarian basket and then a meat basket, but about 20% less meat than is currently consumed. And then looked at what happens if we put 3% or 75% of this basket as organic. And the authors then compared a couple of different baskets and compared this with the different economic chunks of society. And what we see in these little squares is that, for example, here in the blue square, I hope you can see my mouse, if we have a basket, a consumption basket that is 75% organic and is a little bit less meat heavy, and prices of organic are 65% more than conventional, prices for consumers and the cost of the basket will only be about 30% more expensive. And so while there are questions, of course, for the poorest, and this is what this next set of graphs show, we have a situation where there is probably more room for higher prices and more organic production if we talk about a little bit less meat consumption. Finally, and I see time is ticking and I don't want to hold us up, I really want to drive home the point that agroecology will foster the resilience and productivity of EU food systems, which for me, this last part on productivity is responding to the presentation we heard before, and the idea that if we produce more sustainably, we will automatically be in a hunger situation. And I think we've already seen that that is not necessarily something that is self-evident or will happen automatically. But I really want to drive home this point with a couple of graphs that show what will happen if we don't start changing our production methods. And so this graph here shows average yields of wheat from 1815 to 2018. And then some future expectations. And so this line that we've added basically shows the promise or the idea that if we use more technology and land-sparing solutions, we can increase yields and keep continuing to produce more, perhaps with less. However, the worry is that yields have been stagnating, and because of different factors that I'll touch on next, that we'll have actually a situation where yields will decrease if we try to continue as in a business as usual scenario. And so based on our work, agroecology has the potential to stabilize yields, which is essential if we want to keep producing and to deal with some of the food security concerns that are currently being raised. This is a number of different graphs that show that yields have been stagnating for wheat, for barley, for maize in the EU. Mostly overall, there are a couple of countries that have not followed the same trend, but overall we have a situation where overall yields have been stagnating since the 1990s. And so if we say all of a sudden the EU is going to produce more to feed the rest of the world, this is hard to fit with some of the data we have about basic agronomic facts about yield. And finally, I just want to touch on the biodiversity question, because what we see is with landscape simplification, we have less species richness, which has a negative impact on pollination and also production. And so by setting aside biodiversity and setting aside environmental issues, this creates big problems for productivity. As we're talking about climate, I think it's important to note that with the TIFA scenario that I mentioned before, we can also have a reduction in greenhouse gases. And these mostly come from less imported deforestation and, of course, less nitrogen fabrication, because we will be vastly decreasing synthetic fertilizers, and we'll still be keeping some cows around, so the enteric fermentation part will be still the biggest chunk. The numbers, just to keep those in mind, are about 36% of non-CO2 direct emissions. And if you look at a more greenhouse-focused version of TIFA, it can be up to 47% reductions. To conclude, I'll just reiterate my 4 key messages about the food security problems illuminating structural vulnerabilities and allowing us opportunities to fix them. The farm to fork targets are ambitious, but a lot of the critiques don't take into account the whole picture and rather focus on the short term without looking at the long-term consequences of continuing to produce in a business as usual sense without realizing that the environment and ecosystem services contribute to production factors. Third, I want to talk about and remind you that agroecological farming under the farm to fork strategy will have climate change benefits. And finally, the productive and productivity element. If we don't transition, we're not going to be able to continue producing as we do now, most likely. I only have a couple of minutes for policy recommendations, so I'm going to keep these quite short and less comprehensive than the previous presentation, but I hope we'll have a moment to discuss afterwards, and very broad as well. But in the short term, the EU should support developing countries to get access to food in a number of different ways that we can touch on later, and also think about robust safety nets at home, because while EU consumers spend significantly less in their budgets on food, around 15% compared to up to 65% in some developing countries, there are consumers, there are citizens who are poor and will probably need additional help. And in the medium to long term, as I've hopefully stated enough times that it will be forever ingrained in your brains, the EU needs to transition towards more sustainable agriculture to make food systems resilient, productive far into the future. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion moving forward.
Thanks a lot, Nathalie. Also good that you addressed all the individual critics that are nowadays circulating against the farm to fork strategy, but my main conclusion from your presentation is actually the farm to fork strategy is on the right path, and many of the critics are not justified. So that's I think very good to keep in mind. We can go now to discussion with the participants. So everybody is very much invited to share any thoughts, comments, ideas in the chat function. Can wait a little bit. Yeah. Andreas Gattinger has a question, I see. Perhaps we can allow you to speak. Yes, and normally you can open your microphone now. Yes.
Okay. Yep.
Please
Yeah.
go
Thank
ahead.
you. Yeah. Yeah. I have a comment actually for both presenters, or mainly to Alexander. A very good talk, Alexander. And I miss in the whole discussion on the exports of commodities, nutritious aspects, right? What about those commodities which eventually end up in a healthy, sustainable diet for people in Egypt, in Sudan, or elsewhere? We are only talking about wheat, but this is mainly starch and a few micronutrients and some proteins. But if we only look about wheat, people will have malnutrition. And if we look at leguminous crops, which can also be grown in the EU and other exporting countries, we would reduce fertilizer inputs and at the same time provide valuable nutrients to the people abroad, and fuel our soils with rhizobia and roots and soil carbon buildup entities. Yes, this is my question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andreas. So Alexander, or perhaps also Nathalie, do you want to respond to this? The question was addressed in the first place to Alexander, so I will allow him to answer first. So should we also be looking at other crops, not just at cereals and starch?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andreas. Of course, you are right. I did not mention nutrition. I did not talk about the empty calories being shipped around the world. I didn't talk about the question, what are the costs for human health if you eat too much starch and not enough vitamins. So I did not talk about the double burden of malnutrition. Why did I forget it? I haven't forgotten it, but I think in the current situation, it is dangerous if we don't look at the calorie intake. The current problem is that people will get hungry, and the transformation of food systems has to include what you have mentioned. So I think we have to have a combination of immediate support. Egypt imports 70% of wheat. In the 1960s, Egypt was self-sufficient, and currently there is no way that they can produce enough wheat for their bread. And I don't want to come into the situation to say, okay, maybe it's better if they don't eat so much bread. This is part of the transformation. And therefore, in the talks I'm currently giving, I'm concentrating on a two-step approach. First, ensure that people don't starve. And second, immediately and in parallel, transform food systems. And here you are right. In my next presentations, I will mention that food systems have to do with a different nutritious quality. So thank you so much. But let's be careful. Our arguments should not be used against us. And there are many people now waiting and telling me, oh, you are happy that people are hungry because this is a driver for transformation. We are not happy. We are not responsible. The current outdated, unsustainable food system is responsible for this lock-in effect. But thanks, Andreas.
Okay, thank you.
Nathalie, do you want to add on that?
I'd love to jump in. I think this is a really important question that you're raising. And there's some research that's being done at CIRAD that I think will be coming out in the next couple of days that looks specifically at the diet compositions of folks in developing countries, specifically in Africa, to say, well, the wheat is only part of the story because their diets are not only composed of wheat. And so I think thinking about diversity and diversification of agroecological systems is really important because not only in the short term, but also in the long term, we have to think about how to make our own ecosystems and production systems more diverse, but also how we can support partner countries in moving forward and not repeating some of our mistakes with monocultures, but rather relying on diversification to move forward. And then in terms of diets, when we think about legumes and leguminous crops, this is a really important message as well for the EU, because as I mentioned, in the EU, we eat way too many animal proteins. And if we think about a way to move away from the system and move to a situation where we can feed grains to people instead of to animals, having people eat more of these plant proteins in the EU is an important step in that direction.
Thanks a lot, Nathalie. There are two questions in the chat. The first one is from Daniel Zimmer on the role of speculation. Is this really an issue? How is it worsening? How do you see, how do you address, how do you perceive the situation on the speculation? Alexander or Nathalie, whoever feels more comfortable to speak about it.
Happy to continue again. Yesterday in the evening, I deleted a slide where I was talking about there are not only losers in the current situation. Of course, poor people suffer and lose. There are also winners. If you look at the profits made by the big agricultural commodity traders, their profit increases. If you look at how much companies producing fertilizers, their profit increases, and therefore there are also winners. And if we talk about winners, the question is, are there also winners of speculation? Let me give an example. India had for a certain time stopped export of wheat. Why? They said, first of all, we have to feed our own population. Second, why should we allow that commodity traders buy cheap wheat in India and sell it for higher prices at the global market? And therefore, India has changed its export policy. Now they are only supplying wheat to neighbors and selected countries, and they don't allow this type of speculation. So there is definitely a component of speculation, but it would be too short-sighted to say the current crisis has been triggered by speculation only. There are even more powerful drivers behind: the energy prices, the war in Ukraine, and as a follow-up of it, there are winners and there is also speculation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alexander. So speculation is not the real driving force, but is one aspect of it. Natalie, you want to intervene on speculation?
Sure, I think I would agree with most of what's been said, and perhaps have two comments to add. First, in terms of governance, I think speculation is a really important issue that has been repeated and repeatedly been not dealt with. If you look back to 2007 and 2008, it was also one of course, many drivers at that time, and there's been little change to how markets and commodity trade can happen. And then the other question that comes with speculation is the one of economic availability and accessibility versus physical availability of crops. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of the accessibility, the economic issues. So do people have the money, the resources they need to be able to get food, and not so much related to the fundamentals of supply and demand, but there are really big questions in the next couple of months about whether there will be availability of food, and that has already been discussed. But I would like to make that link there to the different branches and the different elements of food security, and also to governance, and say this is a really big global governance problem that isn't being dealt with enough, in my view.
Okay, thanks a lot, Natalie. There's a question from Zachary Jones for both of you. I think you both made very good recommendations to improve policies, and how optimistic are you that these policies will be implemented within the necessary time frame?
Natalie first.
I laugh not because it's funny, but because it is unfortunately not a rosy outlook. I think specifically in the EU, what we've been seeing is a number of derogations on the Common Agricultural Policy regulations in terms of environmental measures. So for example, there have been changes in terms of set-aside land and what can be used for production that will have environmental consequences, but based on preliminary calculations won't have a big impact on food security. And what I've been seeing in Brussels and in Paris and in the other places I have been able to pop in is that a lot of the actors who would like to keep the status quo have really benefited from the situation, unfortunately, and have weaponized a horrific situation that hopefully will end soon, but doesn't look like it will, in order to advance their agenda. In terms of biofuels, there's a little bit of movement to move away from blend mandates, and the Commission has said that they will support states that are saying, you know, we don't need these blend mandates. But in terms of livestock, for example, the member states have really stepped in to say, okay, well, now we'll import from Argentina or from the US that don't necessarily meet our standards on pesticides or GMOs, and do this in order to prop up livestock. So moving forward, I am relatively pessimistic in the short term, but I am hopeful that with enough activism on the part of citizens and NGOs and academics, that we can bring to light some of these issues and make sure that the farm to fork and this one step forward doesn't turn into 3 or 4 or even 10 steps back.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Indeed, Perhaps there's not so many reasons to be super optimistic about policy change, but if we all work together and all, as you said, academics, researchers, NGOs, civil society, pull on the same string, we can make something happen. Alexander, you want to intervene?
Yes. I think we have to be aware, and we are, that the food system is full of vested interests. These are not small companies. These are big multinational companies, and they are very powerful. We know it whenever it comes at European level to the reform of the common agricultural policies. You see all these guys there. You see them at international meetings. And therefore, I think we have to present a comprehensive solution with tackling the acute hunger crisis and transformation. And if they don't agree, we have to ask them, what is your solution? And their solution currently is not sufficient. Their solution is keep the markets open, but they are not open. And even the explanations, we are now trying to bring wheat with lorries from Ukraine to Poland, is not sufficient. Second, their answer is we need more innovation. My question then is, how many years do you want to wait for your innovation? So you don't have an answer. And therefore, my main worry is that the multilateral system is not acting. The UN is not doing what they have to do. And now you mentioned I have been Assistant Director General in FAO in 2008. I had to organize a conference with more than 6,000 participants, 56 heads of states. We negotiated over 4 weeks a declaration, and nothing is happening. Why? Because the multilateral system is also blocked. It's blocked in the same way like the ports of Ukraine. Russia will never agree to it. Belarus will never agree to it. And at least I was happy to see that in the UN General Assembly, 141 votes spoke against the war in Ukraine. But don't forget, China didn't vote for it. South Africa didn't vote for it. Pakistan didn't vote for it. India didn't vote for it. So the multilateral system is divided, and therefore the hunger crisis takes place in a new geopolitical situation. And therefore, I think the European Union has to make a strong call for an integrated solution and not wait for the markets to be open again. So I'm optimistic it could be done, but we have to be very, very political. And we, as those people who are not the friends of fertilizers, we have to present a comprehensive solution in order to force the others to tell us that they don't have a solution.
So we also need to do our homework and come with clear recommendations for policymakers, and we need to reinforce the multilateral system, or at least do our part on the side of the EU. Are there any other questions? So please, the best is that you add your question in the chat. You put your question in the chat. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand. We can allow you to voice your question orally. There are no more questions. Zachary Jones still has a question or a remark. He has to run to another meeting. Okay, but good that you were with us, and thanks for your contributions. All right, then I think I will give the floor to Jacques-Éric to give an introduction to the ClieNFarms project, the project that is hosting today's workshop. And after that introduction, we will go to policy debate with a couple of stakeholders and policymakers. So please, Jacques-Éric, the floor is yours again. And thanks again to Nathalie and Alexander for their contributions.
Is it okay for you? Okay. Thanks a lot for the two previous presentation. So ClieNFarm is just a piece of the general jigsaw, of course, you presented in the two previous presentation. And of course, we hope that what we propose and what we be able to attain won't create any lateral side effect or bad adverse side effect for the general situation, but we're working on it, and that's one of the reasons of this public policy workshop, to try to put in action and to have a different point of view of our proposals. So let me introduce you to the ClieNFarms, that means climate neutral farm. So my name is Jacques-Éric Bergès. I haven't said that for the introduction. I'm working at INRAE, and I'm the coordinator of this very exciting project. So the idea of the project is try to co-develop upscale systemic, locally relevant solution to reach climate neutral and climate resilient sustainable farms across Europe. The idea of locally is very important because Natalie spoke about agroecology, of course, and we know that agroecology may have some general principle, but it's very important to have specific locally solutions, and that's the idea of our project. That's a 12 million project that will last for 4 years and start at the 1st of January. And there's 33 partners on 14 European countries, so it's quite a large project. And the 33 partners will interactively integrate and improve existing solutions to achieve economically viable business models in farming system through multi-actor approach. So the idea is really to demonstrate that innovative systemic solution, we'll see in a moment what we mean by that, have the potential to generate positive impact by 2030 by achieving climate neutrality on farms and farming system, by reducing greenhouse gases emission and increasing carbon sequestration storage. But we need to keep in mind that we need to have farms and farmers viable. So we don't have, it's a very sustainable point of view, environment, predictions, and social. As it started in January 2022, there's no results, it's just a general presentation of what the idea and the concept of our project. There's not a day without alarming news regarding climate disaster due to climate loss of biodiversity, heat waves, and so on and so on. And we know that agriculture is part of the problem that we've seen previously, of course, on using fertilizer, using energy and enteric fermentation and so on. But agriculture is part of the problem, but is of course part of the solution, of the different solution available. And there's a lot of papers, a lot of reports on climate neutrality and climate change mitigation and agriculture, what's the role of agriculture on this mitigation and so on and so on. There's been a lot of European projects dealing with this topic. So what do we think that we can do better or do differently actually? The other concept is that ClieNFarms scope is based on demonstration approach through the creation of ISSS. What is ISSS? I first is innovative. We want to induce emergence and adoption of efficient innovation, including the different elements, such as finance, banks, collaborative proposals, and so on. The main idea is that the farmers at the center, but around the farmers, there's a large ecosystem who have to take part of the effort of mitigation. And that's the innovative aspect. Then systemic, that have to take into account the farm and the surrounding, as I said, suppliers, advisors, researchers, and solutions-based, because we want to propose and tailor different solutions, as I said, regarding agroecology general principle, but a tailored solution for each farm depending on their pedoclimatic condition, resources, and constraint. So the goal of the ISSS is to develop business model that ensure the financial sustainability of the solution with an upscaling methodology. The first level is demonstration farms. That's farms that are experimental or research sites on which we can test a range of existing solutions, quite risky solution, in order to reduce greenhouse gases emission and increase carbon sequestration storage. From this farm, we want to go to a level of 10 for lead commercial farms, which are farmers very interested and keen in pioneering innovation testing and are quite well connected with demonstration farm. We'll be quite happy to test a bit less risky solution. And from these 10 farms, there's 100 outreach farms. So as you can see, it's the idea of the networks, of a spider web, where different nodes can discuss all together. On this outreach farm will be people who come for different events, open days, element of conferences, or part of the same group of discussion by farmers. And there's another level, which has replication farms. As you will see, as part of the projects, there are some big supply chain company like Nestle, Danone, and so on and so on. And this supply chain request sourcing district, sourcing, and farmers for this sourcing. And there can be some reward for farmers who go to mitigation innovation proposals. So that's a general idea, that general ISSS ideas. So just follow the idea of the general project. First, as I said, the idea is to co-design innovation in what we call in the ISSS using Creative Arena. Creative Arena is sort of a living lab approach where there's a discussion between the different stakeholders around the demonstration farms, and where we discuss the pro and the cons of different solutions. This solution come from a big catalog of solutions. There's already a lot of solutions available when you check on the internet, when you check on different reports. Some are existing, maybe some are to be created, some are applicable on the different ISSS, some are not applicable, and some are already applied and some will be applied. So that allows us to have a huge knowledge hub on existing solution and to debate on the solution as part of the Creative Arena. And of course, we put some innovation on the farm. There's a huge need of evaluating the solution. So for that, we need protocols of validation. We need a clear MAV. We also need models and tools to assess, and we need, of course, to not only to stay at the production level, but as I said, to integrate biodiversity, water footprint, social aspect, and so on. From the Creative Arena, which is quite a local aspect, we want to upscale, as I said, to some supply chain element, but also to do some demonstration if we go to Europe level. And for that, we need to upscale this ISSS. And we may also want to test some carbon certification platform that will allow for some rewarding of the effort made by the different farmers. For that, we will create some new knowledge, some new information. And if you want to have a huge impact, more than the 1,000 I show, but all around the Europe and larger, there's a strong need of communication, dissemination, and exploitation of the project results. And that we go through internet, that we go through Twitter, Facebook, and all that stuff. And of course, that's the reason of today's meeting, actually, that we want to discuss with other European projects on what we can propose and to see is there any side effect. We want to discuss with policymakers to see if we can help for some initiatives and to help on some policies. And actually, all that's the structure of our project. The center is, of course, the farms and the demonstration farm of the ISSS. There is a methodological aspect with WP2. There is a huge hub on solutions in WP1. There is the extension upscaling with WP2, the communication dissemination with WP6, and today the WP5. One of the first meetings is today with WP5, and discussion with the different DG of Europe. I spoke about ISSS, but we know that production system is very different across Europe. There is animals, livestock, there's crops, there's special production, and so on and so on. So we try to create this type of ISSS on 20 different climatic, pedoclimatic and production system situation all across Europe. And we also have one test in New Zealand, maybe with partner from New Zealand. And as you can see, there are some demonstration farms which are led by research, and some are more led by supply chain like Danone, Nestle, or Friesland Campina. General output, ClieNFarms knowledge hub, very important, innovative solution. Innovation may come, as I say, from technical, organizational, or financial solution, but it's very important to share about this solution. Farmers network and multi-actor ecosystem, the ISSS, but all the ISSS we put together will be linked together through a network. We also have some truthful methodology because it's important to be able to test and to monitor the improvement in carbon sequestration or reduction in greenhouse gases emission. Metric and standards are integral sustainability. If you're working, if you have good effect in some dimension of sustainability, do have good effect also in the other two dimensions. And as I say, systemic implementation and evaluation and peer-to-peer learning, it's very important because we know that knowledge is one of an important resource from farms, and we need to increase knowledge by learning through training events, or as I said, YouTube videos and stuff like that. And the last one is scaling up Living Lab EU-wide scenarios, innovative business model and carbon credit platform. That's the general output of the ClieNFarm, and of course we hope to have expected impact, providing sufficient, safe, nutritious, healthy and affordable food for all. That's a discussion from this morning. Improving the overall sustainability of food system and improving the resilience of food system to shock and stress. So that just we just started. There is plenty of way to follow the different results and the progress of our project. And I just want to thank, of course, all the partners of the project involved in it. And I will be quite happy to share some results in a coming policy workshop. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Jacques-Éric, for this introduction to the ClieNFarms project. Indeed, it's a very wide project with a lot of partners and many activities. And thanks for summarizing that in only 10 minutes. Then we go to the policy debate, and I will hand over the floor to Daniel Zimmer from Climate Kick, who will moderate this debate.
Thank you very much, Bram, and good morning, everyone. So, as mentioned by Bram, so we will have now a 1 hour debate with the panel, and I will be trying to moderate this debate. So, first of all, I'm Daniel Zimmer, working at Climate Kick, where I'm leading the land use activities. And I'm also working in ClieNFarms together with Jacques-Éric and Bram, particularly on the scaling of solutions across the different systems in which we are working, and working also together with Bram, particularly on these activities related to policy and to connecting our project to many other initiatives across Europe to maximize its impact. I remind you that you can have access to the conversation in the chat to pose your questions to the panelists. And I will also ask the panelists now to maybe switch on their cameras and keep them switched on for the rest of the debate. Thank you all and welcome to this second part of our workshop. So we have we want to build, of course, on the very interesting presentations and discussions that we have had in the first part, but go a bit deeper into the maybe more difficult questions or debated issues and the tensions and synergies between the climate neutral farming activities or the farm to fork policies and related measures and the food security issue. So how does it feel when you work on in certain organizations that are focusing on supporting farmers or developing alternative agricultural solutions? So how does it feel, and what are the concrete solutions that can be implemented? So we have 4 panelists this morning, 4 distinguished panelists, I should say. First one, Herwig Rahner, is working at the European Commission and is the team leader of the climate change team that is part of the unit of environmental sustainability in DG Agri. A bit long, but I think I have to add that Herwig is also one of the EU negotiators for agriculture in the climate negotiations. The second panelist is Eric Gall, who is Deputy Director and Policy Manager at iFarm Organics Europe, so one of the partners of the ClieNFarms project and colleague of Bram. The third panelist is Patrick Pagani, Senior Policy Advisor at Copa-Cogeca, who represents the farmers in Europe, and is coordinator of the Fit for 55 package and leading member of the food security dossier in Copa-Cogeca. And last but not least, Celia Nissens is Senior Policy Officer for Agriculture and Food Systems in the European Environmental Bureau, which is a sort of federation of, I don't know, more than 100 environmental organizations across Europe. Celia is leading her organization's work on agriculture and food policy. Thank you again for accepting to participate. And so we'll go through a first round of questions to each of you, and then offer you the possibility also to react to the answers provided by your colleagues. This will be the first part of our panel. And please, audience, raise also your questions in the chat. We will try to cluster them if needed and ask them also to the panelists. So Herwig Rahner, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, excuse me if not. So we have been discussing the short-term versus long-term debate in the policy measures related to food security. At the moment, some short-term measures being needed, and the transformation mentioned by Alexander also needed in a more long-term or medium-term approach. So what about Europe? How did Europe react, first of all, to tackle the war, tackle the issues of the war or the consequences of the war in Ukraine, and to ensure that the food crisis is not worsening? What are the policies that are in place or that will be in place to ensure, if possible, of course, to manage at the same time these issues of food policies and climate neutral or farm to fork activity or policy directions? And what are the possible synergies between them? So maybe quite a complicated questions. Can you try to highlight a bit of the current situation?
I will give it a try. So in simple words, on the one hand, we have this whole bunch of different initiatives on the policy level linked to the Green Deal, farm to fork, the reform of the common agriculture policy, an adaptation strategy, work that has been started on animal welfare, on biodiversity. So firstly, the CAP also has multiple objectives. So one of the main objectives is to ensure food security in the EU. And historically, that was a very big objective. Lately, we have produced enough food so that we didn't have to worry about that for a long time. Now, it's also the case that for the moment, there's not a problem with food availability in the EU. As we heard, there might be a problem with food affordability. That's a different discussion, and I'm not sure we will have that here. So in the short run, we heard that there were some derogations given because actors in the field made a lot of pressure to have some signals also from the political level that there's something that will be done to ensure food security in the EU. At the same time, the president of the commission, also the commissioner for agriculture, but also the commissioner in charge of climate issues, they all said that we will continue with the Green Deal targets. We will continue to start implementing the farm to fork strategy. And we will, of course, continue with the implementation of the reformed common agriculture policy, which at the moment is at the stage where the Commission and the Member States have very constructive exchanges on the CAP strategic plans. And within these plans, maybe some of you will tell me they are not ambitious enough, but they are the result of a political process between Parliament and Council. Now the Commission is there to implement a political decision, and that's what we are doing right now. We will make sure that whatever has been agreed at this political level will be implemented in the way so that you see it, you reference it in the CAP strategic plans. We cannot foresee what else will happen during this year. The situation with Ukraine, the Russian invasion there is very complex. As has been said, we have rising prices for fertilizers in the short term. We have other products, precursor products that we normally import from other countries that are more difficult to get, of course, and that's something that also our Commission President said. We have to make sure that we are less dependent on such products in the future. That's not something you can solve from one day to the next one, unfortunately, but this is also part of the long-term strategy. While, and that's what I want to repeat, we also have to make sure that we are getting more and more sustainable. We heard about the issues involved already. I will not repeat them. But on the discussion on consumer choices and dietary changes, this also depends on our population, on how they will react to it. One of the problems is that it would not be taken with a lot of, with a positive view if political institutions tell people what they should eat or what they should not eat. Maybe it needs to be done in a different way, so you convince people that it's actually better to have a certain nutrition. And that's where the problem lies. We are very numerous in Europe. We have over 400 million people. And these 400 million people also together need to take decisions. It's very easy to say from top down. When you work in policy development, it's a very different issue when you are a citizen that looks at all these decisions and says, why should I do it? And there's so many other people that don't do anything. I think that's the biggest issue we have, to motivate everybody to take part in this exercise. Because just taking decisions on what we want to do in the long term and how we want to transform our agriculture policy will not produce the results it's by involving people on the ground, and that's farmers and all kinds of other stakeholders. So sorry if that was a bit of a political pitch, but
okay, I think we will maybe come back to this, but what you are alluding to is that all this is the food system is a bit more than just producing food. Huh? It's also involving other actors, and so maybe, I don't know, an assumption is that the policies are not enough interconnected, or we have difficulties to connect the different policies or actions that would need to be connected, in fact. Maybe something to maybe keep in the back of our mind. I will not now go to ask a question to Celia, and I was struck in your introduction. You said at the same time there is no food shortage in Europe, but still there are derogations that have been made or accepted by the Commission. So in March, indeed, there was a communication from the Commission on safeguarding food policy and reinforcing the resilience of our food system. And in this communication, this issue and these derogations were mentioned, and they allow farmers to reduce the amount of land that is in fallow land for their production, which has also obviously implications on the use of pesticides, fertilizers in these sensitive zones that are often less productive. So, Celia, how do you assess this question and the sort of balance between keeping the pressure on the environment, or the pressure, or at least reducing the pressure on the environment, but at the same time increasing food security? How do you assess the balance between the two here?
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for having me here. I think you've already answered the question for me to some extent, but I will elaborate a bit more. So I'd like first to say that it's really important, and that's been alluded to already, but maybe not fully spelled out. But it's really important to consider that food security is not only about having sufficient production, but when it comes to sufficient production, there is no problem. That's been stated very clearly. But food security is also about ensuring that the food that's available is available at the right place at the right time. So it's about distribution. And distribution has very little to do with producing more. It's about supply chains. And then also ensuring, and that's been mentioned, that people are able to afford food and to access it, whether it's growing their own or buying it from the market. And there, it's quite clear that there is an issue both within Europe for the most vulnerable populations, but also very much so in Middle Eastern countries and Northern Africa. And then a fourth dimension of food security that's often forgotten is that it's also about the nutritional aspect of food and ensuring that the food that people are eating is supporting healthy lifestyles. And here there's also a problem that's very clear. We have a really heavy burden of non-communicable diseases caused by diets, which combines diabetes, obesity, but also malnutrition and undernutrition in some parts of the world. So when we have this analysis of what is the problem in terms of food security, it's about distribution, it's about financial access, it's about nutrition. Producing more, mostly wheat and other feedstock crops on our very scarce, environmentally dedicated land is not a solution at all. And I'm really annoyed to have to say this because it's been said again and again by experts. More than 500 scientists wrote a letter a few months ago when this decision was taken, criticizing it and stating very clearly that this was not targeting the actual problem. So then when we look at the other side of your question, well, what is the impact for the environment? One could say, oh, but you know, it's only for 1 year in any case. It's not a huge deal if we dedicate some fallow land to growing crops for 1 year. That's actually been sort of criticized as not being the case by some ecologists and other scientists who have warned that actually removing some scarce lands dedicated to biodiversity for 1 year can have really disproportional impacts on some species. But then on the other hand, we're also not only doing this for 1 year. Now the Commission is looking at extending and expanding these derogations for next year, not only on allowing growing crops on fallow land, but also potentially cancelling the crop rotation rule in the new CAP. And those two measures are not solving the problem and will make the environmental crisis worse. And that is just completely irresponsible and unjustifiable. And our assessment of what's going on is that this is essentially the Commission caving into political pressure and really to opportunism from lobbies and agriculture ministers who are fighting to defend an outdated model of productivist agriculture and trying to win new export markets. That's what it is about. It's got nothing to do with food security. I'm being very direct here. I hope you don't mind it. Maybe I'm stirring a bit of debate, but these are the facts. It's not an opinion.
Yes, thank you, Celia. And indeed, you are just also telling us what we have seen in the media about this debate, which has been quite a lot discussed in several media indeed. And we will continue with this, Patrick, with now, of course, you are presenting here the views of the farmers, and it's very interesting also to understand here what is your perception of the problem. And so we said that indeed the issue was not necessarily about Europe, where there is no food shortage. So according to Copa-Cogeca, or to you, is there a role for EU now to contribute to food security elsewhere in the world? We have seen Egypt, for instance, where so much, or 70% of the wheat is imported from Russia and Ukraine. So is there a role for EU farmers to contribute to this food security globally? And how, according to you, can that be combined with the European ambition? And so how do you, as a farmer representative today, also explain the views here?
Thanks a lot, Daniel. I hope you hear me. And thanks for inviting me and Copa-Cogeca to this panel. Yes, indeed, I am the one who will present a bit of a different opinion, but it's good to have an exchange on this, and it's very interesting to hear the different views. So it's clear that as we discussed before, the world has changed dramatically from the 24th of February. So a war that we thought was lasting, well, 3 days, now we are dramatically and still in this situation, and it's clear that the topic of today it's crucial. So well, the world is discussing how to unblock cereals from Ukraine, and we are discussing, well, about a boat which is somewhere bringing wheat to some countries. So this is really, it gives us some experts before mentioned the geopolitical importance of food security. So this is clear. And it's clear that many international organizations recognize the difficult and the dramatic situation also, and the spillover effect on particularly food availability in third countries, which, as we saw, have strong dependence. You mentioned Egypt. And then we saw clearly the increase of costs of food, fuel, and fertilizer prices globally, but it's an issue also coming in the EU, and this, so here arriving onto the point. It's clear that from our side, and also the Commission recognized food supply is not at risk in the EU, and this is really a responsible message that needs to be provided to outside, to the people. This is clear, and because the EU is self-sufficient of key agricultural products. And we have said this, and it's clear that the role of farmers, but also the food chain in this new crisis after COVID, but this dramatic situation, is again, to continue and provide food to European citizens and also, if possible, to the world. So farmers and the food chain are aiming and are resilient in this context. One issue is affordability, and also here we discussed it before, but I think it needs to be considered. From the farmer's point of view, well, there's an issue of fertilizers price, and we saw before the graphs on dependency from Russia. So this is a topic, feed prices and energy bills. So this is also uncertainty for next campaigns. This is for next campaign, so for 2023, and this is important. We are seeing also the issue again of food affordability, and when you see the figures on inflation, so 10%, well, 8.5% of July, which refer to food, which are close to 10%, or in some countries higher. So this is really the issue that we need to pay attention. And but also all this concept of food security and food affordability, it's clear that it's important in the transformation to sustainable food systems. So this is also the topic that we're having today. And just to mention the forecast of yesterday of DG Agri, so the short-term outlook, which on one side foresee, and in line with ours, as a slight reduction on the production of cereals and increase of oilseeds. But it's clear that there are a lot of uncertainties, and I will come back later to the climate situation. In our view, also uncertainty for 2023, and we have welcomed the words of the Commission President, so on the key role of food security, and also the Commission on Agriculture, but also on the need to step up production. So this was a strong message. So in our view, Europe, in this context of crisis, has also a responsibility to the rest of the world, and in case possible, so by helping European farmers to produce, the EU is addressing also the market disturbance and the possibility to contribute to global food security and affordability. So in our view, there's also a responsibility coming from the EU in this respect. And also the choices. So we have welcomed the choices to the quick action by the Commission, because on 24th of March there was on February there was the invasion. In 1 month, the Commission acted quickly on the situation, and it clearly puts at the center the need to produce food. And I think that one point that the COVID crisis has shown, and also this dramatic war, is to put at the center the production of food, so feed the population. So and farmers are ready to do what they can do best, so produce food for the EU, and if possible elsewhere. So to produce, as I saw a slide before, safe, nutrition, quality food in adequate quantities. So this is a bit our view. And then I wanted to underline one point on climate change. It's clear, and I'm surprised that nobody mentioned this, that we are seeing now farmers are the first to have to feel the consequence of climate change. We are having 10 days. We had here in Brussels, in France, in Italy, that actually, and talking to our members, really on the ground, they lost a lot of their production, they had windows destroyed of the farms. So they are, on the ground, they're putting in place, and they're coping with the consequence. So I think also, as was mentioned before also by the colleague from INRE, farmers are also part of the solution. So I think it's important to look forward to this. And so I'm concluding, and I wouldn't see it as food security against climate action. They can go together, and I think we can continue to the path to sustainability, build on what has been achieved. If we count the reductions of emissions in EU from agriculture, they are quite consistent. And we also need to put the context in a global situation. And there's a commitment to Paris Agreement, which clearly states in Article 2 that climate actions shall not undermine food production. So this is a bit an element to keep in mind. So
okay, thank you. So maybe one takeaway for me is this importance of uncertainty that you are mentioning, but at the same time, this uncertainty comes from the climate, and we see with I don't know, droughts, floods, etc., and at the same time also with from the crisis and the prices of nitrogen that are so this uncertainty. We need to be able to deal with it and of course find the right balance, or at least maybe find the right balance between food security and the climate or the environmental action, keeping in mind the bigger system in which we are with the food and also the three dimensions that Celia mentioned for food security. We will continue this debate probably a bit later. Eric, regarding IFOAM, how do you think agroecological practices such as organic farming contribute to the resilience of food systems? We have seen in previous presentation that there are predictions, or at least some scenarios show that organic farming or agroecology can indeed contribute to the resilience. Can you give us a bit more about this, and how do you see the role of organic farming also in addressing the climate effects and the environmental effects more generally?
Thank you, Daniel. And I will certainly answer to your questions, but I found the two presentations we had from Alexander Müller and Natalie Bolduk very interesting, and I would like to make just a few preliminary comments maybe, because Alexander mentioned that there were also winners in the current crisis, and he mentioned commodity traders in particular. We could add to that companies selling inputs as well, and we know that we are in a system which is very input intensive rather than knowledge and intensive as agroecology is. And I just came back from a conference in the United Kingdom, and I was struck how much the debate is framed around the land sparing narrative in the UK. You know, this idea that you have to produce to further intensify production on some part of land so that you can save a plan for biodiversity in other parts, and how much the debate is framed around, you know, the need to ensure that food is as cheap as possible. And I think it would be very interesting to have some research done on the who spreads such narrative into the public debate, because I think it's part of a problem, you know, that we are discussing this in very broad terms, and that we convey the idea that, you know, we need to produce more and more, when actually there is no contradiction between producing in a more sustainable way and producing enough food as well. And my second point is precisely about communication as well. I mean, Ervik said, you know, there are 400 million consumers in the EU. We cannot tell them exactly what to eat, but actually there are policy plans, you know, to inform consumers about the impact of what they eat. There is a debate already on sustainability labeling in several member states, and also at the EU level. And here I think it's very important indeed to do communication efforts to consumers, and in particular communication efforts about the benefits of organic farming. That was one of the conclusions of a report by the French Court of Auditors last week, because we are in a period where, as we've heard, you know, prices are going up. We saw that from last year, for the first time in years in some countries, the sales of organic products are going down, because we realize many consumers don't clearly know about, you know, what are the benefits of organic agriculture or other standards as well. Organic now has to compete with standards which do not provide the same environmental benefits, but give consumers the impression they buy an organic product, but much cheaper as well. And I think one of the very good things that the Commission did last year is to increase the budget of promotion policies for organic products. So here is a message about policy coherence, and policy coherence also in terms of what information is given to consumers. I think these aspects are very important. My third point is about adaptation. And like Patrick was saying, the impacts of climate change are already there on farmers in Africa, in other parts of the world, but also in the UN. Herwig, being one of the lead negotiators for the European Union in the UNFCCC negotiations, knows very well that for many countries, the priority of this discussion should be adaptation rather than mitigation. So there shouldn't be a trade-off between the two, but it's an important aspect of the discussion, resilience, as you said as well. And my point here is that we have to prioritize measures that provide synergies, that not only reduce emissions, but also provide benefits for adaptation and benefits for biodiversity as well, which is a very important element of the discussion. And last but not least, this is linked to the metrics we have to use in this discussion. They should not only be about carbon when we're talking about land use and the biosphere. So sorry for being a bit long about these preliminary remarks, but what are the benefits of organic farming and agroecology in general? Like it was said, in a context of strong interdependence, which is a problem in terms of crisis, agroecological farming systems are less dependent on external input. That's the ideal of an organic farm, to be independent in terms of input from outside. So we know that with organic farming, you don't have use of synthetic fertilizers, for which our dependency is high at the moment, like it was shown before. No dependency on synthetic pesticides as well. And I would add to that with organic farm in the regulation, you have a certain percentage of feed that has to come from the farm or from the same region. I think it's 60% for ruminants and 30% for monogastric animal as well. So you have all these aspects which are very important for resilience, independence from external input. The second aspect is soil health. Soil health is a cornerstone of organic farming. And part of soil health is higher organic matter content in soils. I mean, it is scientifically proven. You have increased carbon content in soils which are managed organically, because you have longer crop rotations, because you have cover crops which fix nitrogen from the air as well. And if you talk to some farmers, many of them will tell you, that what impacts the most your productivity, your yield, is not so much the variety you use, but the state of your soil, actually. And we know that this is a major element for resilience, also because soils managed organically have a higher water retention capacity. And there are studies showing that in years of drought, yields of organic are more stable. So of course you have a yield gap with organic around 20% on average, but in terms of drought, very often organic farms perform better than conventional farm, thanks to healthy soils. The third point is the genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is an important element of resilience, and you have some wheat farmers experimenting, for example, with composite cross population. Instead of having a single variety, which is, a clone of the same plant in the same field, you have diversity within the field. You have sometimes up to 20 different varieties being grown at the same time. And you have a wheat population which is adapting after 2-3 years to your local conditions as well. And this genetic diversity, also in terms of different crops that you grow on your farm, is also a very important element of resilience. And then I will start just by reminding that you also have limits to stocking density on organic farm. It's in the organic regulation, so that you have less animals per hectare, so that your production is in line with your carrying capacity of the land. That's it, and sorry for being a bit long.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Interesting. It reminds me very much of my work in Africa, where we saw that the usual practice of the farmers to adapt and to mitigate risk is and has been for centuries to mix different varieties of the same crop in the same field. So I'm interested to see that these types of solutions are now established or tested by farmers. Is very, very interesting. I would like now to just open for a few minutes some reactions from the panel to what you said. So who would like to react also to the points raised by any other of you colleagues? Celia, and then Herwish.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll stay brief so that we can touch on lots of different topics, but just wanted to comment on what our colleague from Copa-Cogeca said. And maybe the one and only point that I agreed with him on, which is that food security and climate action can, and I would even say must, go hand in hand. That is very true. And the key to that really is that we need to change the system. I'm not sure that he agrees on this point, but that's something that we really need to consider here in the discussions about food security and climate action. It's not just about small tweaks on the margins. Everything that Eric has said, we agree very much with. It's about bringing back diversity in our farming systems, from the sort of genetic diversity all the way to the landscape level and diversity at landscape level, which in itself then brings resilience. So we really have to rethink how we produce food. But another side of the coin is that we can't have a sort of safe climate and food security for everyone around the world unless we tackle the land and resource footprint of our consumption in the EU. And I'm not sure that that's been mentioned enough. Here I would also sort of jump in on what Herwig said, that I disagree that when it comes to sort of changing diets, we just kind of have to wait and rely on consumers to do it. It's not about telling people what to do and not about telling people what to eat, which, by the way, we are doing today already anyway with, for example, the promotion policy of the EU, where the EU is spending phenomenal amounts of public money advertising meat, for example. And I know that that's changing, but it's changing a bit too slow. But it's about creating a system and sort of an economic and social and cultural environment in which consumption that is sustainable and that is healthy is the norm. And that requires policy action. There's no way around it. Private sector actors are going to continue to act according to what makes sense economically for them. Consumers are going to continue to make the easy choice, which for now is the unhealthy and the unsustainable one, unless we act from the policy level to change that. And that is fundamental. There's very large evidence base that we can sort of feed Europe with an agroecological system only if we reduce the land and resource footprint of our consumption. If we keep consuming as much, especially in this case, animal proteins, which require so much land and resources to be produced, then of course we're going to have huge carbon leakage and we're going to have a sustainable transition in Europe at the cost of other countries, and we can't afford that. But if we put in place those changes, then we can restore the biodiversity crisis by producing differently, reducing our footprint. We can contribute to solving the climate crisis, and we can have food security. But we can't just look at one solution and go all that way. We have to look at the whole system for that.
Okay, I think it's interesting because this definition of the system is probably one of the tricky and difficult aspects of the question. But Herwish, do you wanted also to react?
Yes, and also try to be short, but we should discuss what is short, because I think no one of us was actually short. Firstly, to say that yes, the promotion policy that was in place until now actually promoted all kinds of products, not specifically meat, but it was also there was also something on meat, of course, because it's part of the range of products that we have. Now we reformed that one, so you have a stronger focus on sustainability also in the promotion policy. And yes, we inform our public a lot on choices they can make. And so far, and that's what I meant before, is there's no political push to limit consumption of certain items. So not saying you should only eat meat twice a week, because we are not sure how that would be taken up by the population. If you give them choices and you inform them well, that might be a different thing, but you can have a discussion if this is the better strategy or not. Then I heard Article 2 mentioned in the convention, just for completeness. There's also Article 4 and especially Article 4.1d that I always have to remind our colleagues from certain developing countries that it's in there. And this is about the importance of preserving ecosystems, mitigation, and so forth. So just for the people that listen and have not much knowledge about the content of the convention. And what Eric said would also agree. We have a lot of policy on organics, and we are going to develop that further. We have a whole unit in our directorate working on organics. And agroecology was one of the issues that the EU was pushing in the last session of the climate negotiations, and we got a lot of pushback from, funnily enough, developing countries, and I still do not understand why that was. But we will continue to make our points because it's part of our common agriculture policy also. We have elements of agroecology in there. It was not only developing countries, also some developed countries, but not naming any names. So you see that at the international level also there's a big problem of understanding what we should do. Yeah, so this can only be solved by more communication, by more getting together, and also through these kind of negotiations that we have, not only on climate change.
Yeah. Maybe Patrick, you want to react quickly, please, so that we can have other topics.
Yes, just to put it in the context. So farmers at the end, yes, they want to do their business. So business, their activity, to grow their crops, work in livestock. So at the end, the idea is really, if there is an income, there's a possibility to produce. This is the main aspect. But I wanted to focus on the issue of the transition. It's clear that this is the direction. But it needs also to be the tools and time, and also to keep in context the three elements of economic sustainability, economic and environment together. So I think this is very important, and it's clear that you need to go forward to the transition, but you need to means and times. And it's not that one excludes the other. In the sense, agroecology and organic clearly has an important role. But on the other side, as I said, you need the means, you need a market, for example, and this is also an important element where towards the institution are working. You need innovation, you need best practice. So this you need to put all in the context. And one point, talking about the sustainable food systems and farm to fork, it's clear that all these elements, all the cumulative crises were not considered when they were proposed. So this is a point. And it's interesting also to recall this food security, or all elements of food security study that the Commission should undertake, which was announced when the nature package was presented. So this will be also can shed more light on the food security topic.
Thank you. Bram, do we have questions in the chat?
Yes, we do have one question from Clara Crebeau about organic development of organic farming. So she says that currently organic farmers are well compensated for their decline in or yield gap because they get higher prices. But if organic develops and there's going to be more supply and demand doesn't follow, prices might fall, and then farmers will not be compensated for the loss of yield. So perhaps that's a question that Eric can address.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Bram and Daniel, and thank you, Clara, because I think this is a very important question indeed. But first, true cost accounting, like Alexander Müller mentioned, I think it's an important element of response to this question. Yes, the price of food is relatively cheap compared to its negative externalities, which are paid by taxpayers. I mean, if you look at water quality. The Court of Auditors in France concluded that it costs from 500 to 1,000 million a year to the French government for water depollution, and they compared it with how much the government spends in conversion to organic farming, in supporting conversion to organic farming, which is 35 millions. That's why water agencies in France are the biggest contributors to subsidies to organic farmer. So in terms of how much the food costs, we're not paying for the true cost of food. And I think in the system where in conventional farming, very often farmers do not get a decent income. They have to sell that product at a very cheap price, sometimes under their cost of production, and it is compensated by the money they receive partly from the CAP. And many of them, when there is a crisis, especially in the animal sector, they have to give up farming, and it's a social drama, an economic and social drama for farmers as well. So these questions of how farmers are remunerated is really a key question. That's one of the key principles of organic farming. So Clara is right. We need to ensure that the organic sector does not reproduce, some of the issues we have in the conventional system where farmers are really pressured to sell under the costs of production. So yes, it's a matter of supply and demand, but here as well to increase demand, and it is highlighted in the EU Organic Action Plan, public policy has a key role to play. Public policy has a key role to play to increase the production of organic, but it has a key role to play to increase the demand for organic product through promotion and communication actions. We already talked about that, but also through making sure that you have a share of organic product in public procurements, so that you have more organic products in public canteens in school and hospitals, like it is done in many member states already, so that you increase the demand for organic products and you increase the débouché. I'm not sure what's the right English term, but you increase what's the available market for organic farmers as well. So of course there is a need to develop organic farming in balance on the demand side and on the supply side, and here public policy has a key role to play in both these aspects. But it should not be only the burden of consumers who are willing to pay more to buy organic products to ensure that there is this transition of a food system. So this is why public policy is very important also in these discussions.
Thank you. Are there other questions, Bram? Yes.
Yeah, Herwig has complimented that adaptation and mitigation go hand in hand. So that is not, we should not just go only mitigation or only adaptation. They go hand in hand, and often the same measure contributes both to mitigation and adaptation. Perhaps some of the other panelists want to add there as well.
I have to comment here that I really feel that one of the areas where that could be explored a bit more is indeed on the synergies between the two, because farmers in general, their entry point to the climate issue is very often adaptation, and so they are very sensitive to this risk management. And so how could we leverage these adaptation measures to create momentum also for the farmers to move and to transform their system would be for me one of the areas. But sorry, I'm not a panelist, and I give the floor now. Who wants to comment on this? I see Patrick and Herwish. Yes, and okay, Herwish, can you start?
Okay, just to say that this is an artificial discussion, because the fact that you say that farmers care about adaptation, farmers don't care about adaptation. Farmers care about being able to produce, being able to, well, firstly feed their families, as is the case in many developing countries, and then maybe have something more to sell. And they care about measures that are supported, but in concrete terms, that means somebody coming, showing them what they could do differently, or showing them how they can use less resources like fertilizer, how to preserve water, whatever. So we call that adaptation and mitigation, but for people on the ground, that doesn't really matter. So what the real discussion is in these policy development circles, yes, we have this separation. Why? Because in the beginning, the whole system of the UN was focused on energy. In energy, you can separate adaptation and mitigation perfectly well. In agriculture, it might be one of the only sectors where this is not possible. And this has caused us many problems over the last years in the negotiations. But basically, as you say, you do both. There's synergies. My brother is also a farmer. He doesn't go out in the morning and says, I will do some adaptation today. What he will do is he will look at his field and see where the problematic points are. Do I have too much water, not enough water, problems with pests, whatever. And that's what people need to see first. And we focus a lot on discussions. They're very high up in the air if you compare it to what happens on the ground. And it's really not important what any of us thinks, if it's more adaptation or more mitigation. We talk a lot about sustainability as the EU, because we think the whole issue of sustainability is more easily understandable, that you say you can still produce next year, you will still be able to feed people, you will still be able to sell something, and you will still have the same quality of your environment or your soil. That's what you put under sustainability. So that
Thank
was
you.
a bit of a plea, but
Yeah.
well.
Patrick, I saw that you reacted. Do you want to add?
No, good, I think, right words from Herwig. They wanted also to put in the picture the issue, for example, of carbon farming, that we didn't put it. And in the sense that also there, carbon farming, we hear the deferred, so yes, so mitigate and absorb the CO2 emissions, but also have a market about them. So this, we talked a lot about it. And if you think that the first legislative piece in the EU where there is carbon farming is the Farm to Fork with sentences, in the sense there is a lot of time to put it in place, these new initiatives, a lot of experience on the ground. There are many pilot projects also financed by EU, and this is very welcome. But really there is need time and market to put in place, and actually for farmers to say, yes, I can do this. Also, if there is a remuneration, so also there are some uncertainties to tackle, and so it's good to see that they will have a legislative piece, but we need to see also how and if the uncertainties are solved. This I wanted to add, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Eric, I saw that you also wanted to react.
Yes, if I may, I mean, it's good to hear from Herwig that, you know, there's no separation between adaptation and mitigation, but in policy debates, very often there is. And I think it's an important discussion because there is a real risk of trade-off between the two, you know, because you can have so-called solutions which are pushed, which on paper, you know, reduce emissions, but which will make the farming system much less resilient to crises. And very often these are very much, you know, technology-oriented solutions as well. So I think it's an important discussion. Also in relation to what Patrick just mentioned, which is this carbon farming initiative. I mean, as far as the organic sector is concerned, we are very much worried that the discussion will focus only around carbon and only around the carbon metrics, which would be a problem to really have a multidimensional approach. You know, how can you have a multidimensional approach which takes into account adaptation, protection of biodiversity, if you only use a metrics which is solely about carbon? So for all these removals and land use, it's really crucial to have multidimensional metrics, which also tells you how your system provides benefit in terms of resilience and in terms of biodiversity as well. And this is what we expect also from this carbon farming initiative, because I must say the organic movement at the moment very much supports the idea that, you know, we need to have more healthy soils with more carbon, but we are a bit skeptical that farmers will really benefit from a carbon farming initiative based on a market-based approach, because we see by experience also from the US that it's mostly, you know, consulting companies which make the most of the money in such a system and not the farmers themselves. So we would rather see a more management-based approach, because we know the practices which are good for soils already, and funding by public money, and first of all the CAP as well.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, Celia.
I know we're running out of time, but if I could just very quickly jump in here, I agree with what Eric has just said. And yeah, we see a real risk that going all in for voluntary carbon markets or any sort of carbon market, to be honest, would really not necessarily deliver any climate benefit and would not necessarily provide the right kind of support for farmers either. So we could end up with a lose-lose situation. And the way that we see is really the solution here, which links back to the debate on adaptation and mitigation, is that we are hearing from climate and environmental scientists that the key really to have long-term carbon storage in ecosystems is to not start from the perspective of the carbon, but to start from the perspective of biodiversity, because healthy ecosystems contain more carbon and will keep that carbon stored longer and through climate shocks. When an ecosystem is healthy, it's better able to adapt and to resist pests attacks or droughts and etc. And I mean, that's something that we are seeing every day. We see monoculture plantations dying from heat waves and droughts, whereas healthy forests and sort of diverse real forests are still surviving. And so in this all efforts on carbon farming and really boosting carbon removals, we have to start from how can we restore these ecosystems. And then once we've done that, we can count the carbon and see, okay, what's the benefit from carbon perspective? But that shouldn't be the starting point. And if we don't start from that and we start from biodiversity, we could have huge win-wins. And then we need to find how to support farmers and land managers adequately, and indeed maybe look rather at the management practices, not just at the results, so that we can really support them properly. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think this is quite an important point also for our project on ClieNFarms. So we are indeed working on climate neutral farms. So we already increased the boundaries from carbon neutral to climate neutral. But and it's clear that then the resilience, the adaptation part needs to be also embedded in the solutions that we will be promoting. So I think you are really highlighting this need to take a more holistic approach, and I think this is really where also we would like to go, and we need to go. Are there any final words from any of you on the different points? Otherwise, or any question also, Bram? Are there some remaining questions?
No, there are no more questions in the chat.
Okay, Hervish, you still want to say
just on carbon farming, because this is something that's being developed. We are not at any point where there's a decision on how we're going to do it. There will be a look into certification of credits. It all depends how you do such a market system and what the purpose is, and is it open for the outside? Is it something internal that you use to create incentives to have more soil carbon? Of course, it's all linked to the biodiversity. We are very much aware of that, and nature-based solution and this whole discussion. So we are working on that as the Commission. You have to be a bit patient also to see what the measures from the new CAP will do, because they are not even started yet. So 1st of January 2023, you can say that we start with the new program, and then we need a little bit of time to look at what happens if we did the right thing, and we will also check what are the member states doing and how that measures up to what we planned. And yeah, I think I go back to what I said in the beginning. There's no from today to tomorrow changes possible, unfortunately, and especially not for carbon in the soil.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the debate and we know that the issue is very complex, so we cannot solve everything, of course, in one debate like this one. But I nevertheless would like to thank you very much for your different contributions and the interesting exchanges that was facilitated through this panel. So thanks again, and I leave the floor now to Bram also to give us some conclusions.
Yeah.
or at least highlight some of the
some
points?
highlights. It's not an easy job to summarize the breadth of the discussion we had today. I think it was a very rich, interesting discussion with many contributions. But what I learned today is that we are indeed different crises coming together. We have the climate crisis. We have with conflicts in Ukraine, Russia, but also in many other parts of the world. The COVID crisis, we're not still not recovered, and this leads to a crisis of costs, an increase of prices of food, but also fertilizer and fossil fuels, which is affecting people in the EU, but also outside the EU, especially these countries that are dependent on imports, again, imports of food, but also imports of fertilizer. And we need short-term responses and long-term responses to this. We need, and also to make sure that the responses that we implement today don't hamper our long-term vision for more sustainable food systems. And we heard from Nathalie that despite the critics on the farm to fork strategy, actually it's a good step in the right direction. Of course, all depends then in the end on how these farm to fork targets are implemented. And we heard from Eric that also the metrics that are being used to measure progress are very important. If we just focus, for example, only on carbon and only measure the carbon and don't look what happens in the other like what happens on biodiversity, on what happens with water footprint and so on, we might be going we might be thinking we're going in the right direction, but actually we are not. Agroecology was mentioned a couple of times as a good solution, as the way forward to address current crisis and future impacts. And organic being one example or one concrete implementation of agroecology on the ground. We heard from Eric 3 main principles. That's using less inputs, strengthening soil health, improving soil health, and fostering genetic diversity. So these are like three principles for creating more sustainable farm systems. We also heard about the different role of policies. I already mentioned the farm to fork targets, and these need to be implemented through different policies. We've talked about the CAP. It's a crucial time now where the CAP strategic plans are being negotiated with member states, and so a lot will depend on how green these plans will actually be and how they will be implemented. But there's also the regulatory framework for sustainable carbon cycles coming up, and how these carbon markets will be set up. Also, will have a big influence on whether we will make real progress, or if this only going to be reduction of carbon on paper, but not in the real world. And it's also still a lot of concerns remain on whether farmers will really be benefiting from these markets or other initiatives. The role of biodiversity has been mentioned a couple of times. Celia said actually that we should not be looking all the time at the carbon, but biodiversity should be our main lens to look at the things. And if we have stable systems, if the biodiversity is rich, and if the ecosystems are healthy, then the carbon will follow. Then a final thing on imports again. We said, yeah, we are highly dependent on imports, cereals, oil crops, fertilizers. But then if you look actually what these imports are being used for, a high percentage, more than half, for meat consumption, also for biofuels, then actually means that we are using the imports for the wrong thing. So if we would reduce meat consumption, if we would not put our cars with biofuels, then we would solve a lot of the pressure on the food system. And also the role of food waste has been mentioned. We are losing a lot of waste. We're losing a lot of food. We're wasting a lot of food. And this, yeah, if we would solve the issue of food waste, then we would not have such a high pressure on food supply and food security. And so with that, I would like to finish our first public policy workshop organized by ClieNFarms. It has been a really good discussion, I think. Also, as partners in ClieNFarms, I think we can take a lot of what we heard today and integrate these messages in our own research. But I hope also from your side that you have learned a lot and that you can implement these messages in the work that you do, either as a farmer, as an advisor, as a policymaker. And then as a last word, I wish you a very nice afternoon and a good weekend.